basically, we've been planning this for some time, and a lot of different reasons why it hasn't happened yet. I've been anyway, but I've been wanting to interview you, and we just in general wanted to help lay out the Cannibal Troll kind of philosophy. Is that a good way to put it? The philosophy.
Yeah, it is sort of a method. People pick on me and while you're on the script, it is a little bit of a script, and it's based on an old moral system,
right?
Really old moral system, which is also a little bit of a script.
And that's kind of what I wanted to approach it from, because what's interesting is me and you have different ideological beliefs, but where we find alignment is this moral system in terms of this desire, in terms of almost like an integrity approach. And there's a lack of integrity and dialogue. And I don't want to speak for you, just for myself. For me, I don't even care as much about the people who are acting outside of integrity in discussion as much as about the compound impact that has in the discussion as a whole, with other people, with the discussion on the topic, and how that kind of magnifies and plays out culturally. And if we can make those exchanges more moral, which you, in a sense of, and I know people might think of some of the things you say and be like, that's not moral. But when we're talking morality, I think we're talking along the lines of integrity, of honesty, of willingness to be corrected, of willingness to be objective when when you might not know what you're claiming to know. These are the things we're referring to, right?
And it is a communication issue. It's very much a communication issue, because there's a lot of people that don't communicate effectively. They think of communication as like a video game, or like a sort of phishing. They're not actually sharing messages. They're not actually accepting messages. And very often you see these people getting aggressive, and it's not always really clear why they're being aggressive. And on top of that, there's people who are deliberately not communicating. They're either disingenuous because they're trying to sell something, or they're disingenuous because they're basically doing some sort of dramatic play. And if you apply the right standards, the right methods of communication and discovery, it exposes them.
We had a discussion a while back on a live about writing yourself out of script, or writing yourself into script, however you want to put it. But basically, kind of to piggyback on what you're saying there, instead of looking for a true discussion on solutions or on opposing concepts to try to flush out the bad of both concepts and get to a better concept, instead of that, it just becomes this Sims-like exchange, right? Where just a one-up one another.
That's a new thing. The new trollization, the effort by certain people, or the effort by certain parties to actually defeat communication, to demoralize people, make them think that our forums are worthless, that there's no point to discussion. And I've actually run into people who actually take that attitude on purpose. Like they believe that to be true, that the discussion is pointless and all that's left is trolling.
Right. Well, and something I've been saying to different trolls recently that I've identified as trolls basically is you're only trolling yourself, because what ultimately happens when a person is trolling intentionally to that degree for so long without the intentionality behind trying to break or fracture the troll, what ends up happening is that troll starts to convince himself or herself of things that they were initially saying just to be provocative, just to get a reaction. They didn't even believe them at first. But as they go down the troll pathway, they start making, a good example is, did you ever see the movie Other Guys? With Mark Wahlberg, Will Ferrell. So there's a scene where Mark Wahlberg does this ballet move, and Will Ferrell's like, "Where'd you learn ballet?" And Mark Wahlberg basically says, "Hey, people used to picked on me, called me a fairy, so I learned ballet. He said, you learned how to dance ironically? So basically, people mimic their behavior so much on something they don't even believe in initially, and then they start to troll themselves and convince themselves of certain things that are just ludicrous, they're bad communication techniques, everything along the line. So when you're trying to cannibal troll, it's as much about kind of snapping the troll out of their conditioned behavior as it is about one-upping the troll, right?
It can be, and that the idea of a pattern interrupt is it's an old one. It's from NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and very often people get on this sort of script when they start trolling. Trolling is mostly ego defense mechanisms. Trolling is mostly a matter of avoiding a connection, or avoiding a correction, or avoiding a truth that they really can't get away from.
It's oftentimes a defense mechanism, and it's oftentimes used to block internalized conflict to a certain degree, right? Because the person doesn't want to be conflicted.
Hold on a second,
yeah.
We don't. When you start speculating about people's motivations,
Sure,
or internal mental states, you're kind of going off the rails because ultimately we can't really tell that. When you talk to somebody, you can sometimes glean that. But for the most part, you can't really judge that ahead of time.
Sure. But when we're talking about patterns, and when we're talking about patterns of behavior, a lot of times, just in general, not just in trolling, but when you're doing projection instead of reflection, or instead of being willing to accept correction, for example, a lot of times, regardless of trolling, that has to do with that internal conflict.
That's a passive aggressive pattern,
right?
Where someone fails to communicate, and so they start telling you what they think of you. It's like, it doesn't fucking matter what you think of me, right? I'm curious to know what's in your mind. When you start responding with your impressions of me, you're avoiding any real discussion,
right?
You're not actually telling me about the philosophical thing. You're not telling me about your experience. You're telling me about me, and most of the time, it's a giant deflection. It's a giant evasion, and it doesn't actually communicate.
And you see the evasion techniques a lot in trolling, right?
Well, it's a generic failure pattern. It's a very common generic failure pattern. That's why it sort of starts to turn into a script, because people get on this script, and it's obvious. When you're actually curious about what someone has in mind, and they're refusing to tell you, it's pretty obvious that they're refusing to tell you. And if you chase that curiosity, if you actually do your best to find out what they have in mind, this is the weird part. This is why I call it cannibal trolling. Sometimes people get pissed off. Like, that's the thing. The whole idea of cannibal trolling started out with me ages and ages ago, when I would just apply basic empirical standards to the things people say. And it turns out that if you're honestly curious about what they mean, and you honestly evaluate the things they've said by comparing what they've said to the reality, by asking them for the grounds for their ideas, if they're just bullshitting and they don't really want to admit it, they get pissed off.
Right.
In other words, as soon as you try and do any kind of cursory investigation of what they really had in mind, the ones that you're trying to get away with something don't like it.
Yeah.
And that's what starts that generic failure pattern.
And when you say empirical standards, what standards are you looking for when you're identifying, or I guess what standards are you applying, and then what behaviors do you see in response to those standards when you're identifying a troll?
Well, empirical standards are just the idea of making sure that your ideas connect up to something besides pure bullshit. It's not even. It's just the general idea in science overall is one of integrity. Our ideas have to connect up to all the other ideas and all of our other experiences. There's one universe, and it's all connected. And if your nonsense doesn't connect to anything, it shows, and everybody can tell that you're being full of shit. And people who are trying to get away with something, they don't like that. They get pissed off, and they feel like they're trolled. There's an asymmetry that goes with the idea of cannibal trolling, and it's not really technically trolling. To actually honestly evaluate something according to empirical standards isn't a type of trolling. That's what people do to actually connect to each other. To actually communicate means to talk about this shared reality that we have, this universe that we're all a part of. And if your words and if your messages and your communications don't connect up, then you spiral off into this little world of your own.
Yeah, and when you see someone, I guess, go through the process when you're going through the process of identifying a troll and then trying to initially get the troll to, I would call it, join the...
Right off the bat, you're already in trouble. I don't know who's a troll.
No, I'm not saying an individual. I'm saying when you notice the pattern of behavior of any troll. So walk through the process of what behaviors you pick up on to identify the troll, and then what behaviors you then exhibit to try to get the troll to rejoin the conversation on the real basis instead of the trolling.
Well, most often the way this starts is when somebody says something kind of outrageous, and I will actually, answer them and say, well, what do you mean by that? Or what evidence do you have for that? Or why do you think that? And as soon as they get aggressive, as soon as they start getting an attitude, they're trying to scare you off. They're trying to deflect away from explaining themselves. They're trying to, distract you or, get you onto a different subject. A real popular one is when they try and get you to introspect, as if looking for your grounds is a problem, as if being curious about what they mean is an aggression.
So an example of that would be something along the lines of, you say, what do you mean by that, or what evidence do you have for that? And they would respond along the lines of something like, well, it says a lot if I have to even explain it to you, right? Is that a good example of that?
That's a great example of a deflection.
To an introspective deflection.
You're not even worth the discussion.
Yeah. Instead of responding to what you ask, they tried to get you to look introspectively at why you even asked the question. And in my opinion, that's a gaslighting technique. But basically, the objective there by the troll is to get you to immediately question yourself and why you asked the question, to be able to avoid giving evidence. And most of the time, I would say all of the times I've encountered that, it's because they don't have evidence, or their case for the argument isn't strong. And even if it's an argument that has some truth behind it, it's all based on their emotions. They haven't done the legwork to be able to give evidence to support their notion. And so they just try to project that that technique to get someone deflecting and looking, why did I even ask that question? As opposed to, well, no, I'm allowed to ask any question. Why can't they give me evidence to support their claim?
Well, that root idea of what is your intent, that often comes out. And this is there is a certain type of pattern that goes along with this, where, because mostly what we're talking about are bullying techniques.
Correct. Yeah.
The root idea behind bullying, the root motivation behind bullying, is to avoid one's responsibility. And if people are trying to avoid the responsibility of backing up their shit, they will often get aggressive and start picking on you. There's like sexual shaming. Oh, well, you must be a fag to think that, or whatever.
Yeah.
And if you follow up on that, very often they'll get angry and try and turn it around on you. They feel put upon by being held accountable. If they pick a fight and you beat them in the fight, then they'll get angry at you and call you a bully, which is standard operating procedure for a bully. And you can follow up on that and end up talking about their intentions, and you can also end up talking about their consent. Well, I didn't consent to this. Well, actually, if you pick a fight, you did consent to losing the fight.
Yeah.
That's actually how it works.
Well,
you can't actually pick a fight and then bitch about getting your shit kicked.
One thing I used to say to my friend, and I still say to different friends, but one thing I said first to a friend named David of mine was, it's equally possible that I could be wrong. But what I'm really trying to say by that is it's equally possible I could be right. So, because you're putting a claim on the table, and when someone's deflecting away from being evidence-based, it's a bullying technique to try to get away from the fact that I might have picked a fight here that I can't win. And so when that happens, and the challenge in that moment is reminding them that, hey, it's equally possible I could be wrong. But guess what? It's equally possible you could be too. And if you're not even willing to meet in a discussion format, what are you here for? And that's where you get to what you were just talking about, the intentions, the motivations behind some of the trolling.
Well, and that kind of brushes up on the idea of the upside down moral system. The basic idea of science, the basic idea of empirical standards, is that you're open to rational criticism. You're looking for mistakes. You're looking for errors. This comes back to what's called the problem of induction. To make a statement like all swans are white, we can't actually prove that. Now we might find a swan that's not white, and then it's easy enough to say that that they're not white, but to actually prove they're all white is impossible.
Right.
And so science, when science tries to establish these truths, what we find is that it can only work in a backhanded way, where we can only disprove the false things.
Right.
And so do proper science means to come up with crazy ideas and then look for reasons to be wrong.
Well, Popper, what was Popper's, basically, the way I've said it, and then you enlightened me that this is similar to Karl Popper, is that I would always say we never get things right, we only get them less wrong.
That's right. And the idea of falsification is exactly that. So anybody who shows up with the wrong attitude, first of all, it stands out. It shows. A lot of people don't realize this, but it completely shows. If you're avoiding falsification, we can tell. We can see you trying to sneak away from the truth, trying to evade the truth. The more that you try and get them to focus on that one point, the more that they run away and avoid, the more obvious it is that they are fearful of it. And that's that upside down moral system. And as soon as they end up on the upside down moral system, they start misbehaving in worse ways. And again, it shows. A lot of these people that get in the upside down moral system, where they're trying to avoid refutation instead of seeking criticism, the more that it shows that they are afraid of something, that they're on a mission to find an escape hatch. They're on a mission to destroy the credibility of the person talking to them. This is a very, very common pattern that stands out like a sore thumb.
Yeah.
There's ways to defeat it, and there's ways that sort of attachment that shows up, it becomes an addictive pattern.
Yeah, truly, one of the things that I would say almost breaks my heart for some people I feel like have trolled themselves into being trolls is I see this pattern a lot, and correct me if I'm missing anything, but when the objective data is no longer supporting them at 51% or greater, that's the way I put it. So basically, once the pendulum has swung from their false assertion to objective data no longer gives you a majority claim that you could be right, they begin character assassination either on the person delivering the objective data or the person who presented or wrote the objective data. And it becomes a character argument instead of a data argument. Do you see that a lot?
And almost immediately. That's a very, very common thing. And you end up with you've seen these arguments that go nowhere for days. It's just two people, you'll see them arguing, and they aren't even talking about the original content. You might not even know what the original content is. They've just got some ancient fight that somebody started, and the only thing they've got to say about each other is stuff about each other. And nobody has any evidence for anything.
And to bring that back into one of the main techniques that you go over in your book and that you brought up here about making the person who asserts the claim provide evidence is when you immediately respond to a oftentimes glamorized or falsified notion, if you just immediately respond with almost an emotionless call to evidence, right, then I would call that make them prove their statement before responding to anything else. And because by doing that, it avoids that I would say tit for tat that begins to happen, where they no longer are talking about the initial claim. I think we actually saw this with what's his name, Kyle Schneider, the other day. So Kyle was wanting to move the discussion from what the legal, call for a white person is, if you're going to file for political office, to all of these different arguments that was no longer that argument. And we had to grab Kyle and keep him on the discussion, actually take the original post meme, put it into the thread because of how much evasive techniques he was using. And so effectively, I think that you hit in your book really well on this effect, where you say make the person support, and I'm not quoting from the book, but just paraphrase.
That's exactly right. A lot of people have it in their head that an argument or a discussion or a debate is person versus person, and it's not. And some of these formal debates, it's idea versus idea, but that also isn't really going to work out. If you're applying empirical standards, the real question is your theory versus your theory being wrong.
Yeah.
Those are the two options. So as soon as somebody puts up a claim, as soon as somebody makes a statement and says, well, here's what I think is true, then the follow-up is, well, why do you think that's true? Well, you're just an asshole. No, I'm not. You're just deflecting. Now, if you don't have anything to back that up, that's okay. But if you keep starting a fight because you don't want to back up your shit, that means you're full of shit.
Yeah.
And that's the moral issue.
And here's how that, I feel like, in my opinion, and hurts on a larger scale. Because if we were able to just have discussion objectively on concepts and ideas without the initial self-protected notion that we have to be right, and so we start projecting and we don't back anything up, we make up false shit. If we would just have these objective discussions where neither of us expect each other to be correct and full, we could come to a lot better concepts in terms of discussing disagreements, in terms of how we, cohabitate as a society together. It really does, on a major level, this communication gaffu. It really messes up progress, doesn't it?
Well, it's a good question how far it goes. Generally speaking, bad communication or difficulty communication with communication is the source of all aggression.
Sure, I would agree.
Like people that want to pick a fight, it's usually because they can't really express themselves in a way that's any good to get the result they want. Like the communication, the meaning of your communication is the response you get. And people who don't get the response they're looking for often turn aggressive to try and get the proper response. But of course, if you get aggressive, that just pushes people away, which is more frustrating and leads to more aggression. And in the worst case scenario, it can lead to wars.
Yeah. Well, and you were going to that level, and I appreciate that, because what I was on a almost war level, we see almost a communicative civil war inside of America right now. It's not physical, but there's this communicative civil war going on. And back in 18, long story short, but there's a discussion I had with the person who was running for office where basically I mentioned to him and he agreed, until we can agree on how to discuss disagreements, the agreements have less weight to them, right? Because there's a lot of different things that go into resentment, begrudging agreements, and then it actually causes more anger. It's counterproductive sometimes, even when you have leveraging going into agreements as opposed to a common discourse. So really, you could argue that the inability to discuss opposing concepts or even agree on how to do that is the root of the majority of conflicts, right? Because if you could discuss it, the conflict wouldn't exist.
Absolutely. The whole point of communication is to influence each other, to get ideas between each other, and to get other people to behave in different ways. And if communicating the ideas doesn't work, then people can often turn very pushy. In terms of the mechanics of the discussion, people often turn around and start discussing the discussion. Like, okay, I don't want to talk about your original theory. I don't want to talk about your original contention. I want to talk about you. I want to talk about what you already said. You see these discussions sometimes, these long discussions, where people they spend 2 or 3 comments making an argument, and they spend another 150,000 comments talking about those first 2 comments. No, I already said that. No, you didn't. Yes, I did. No, I didn't. I already told you this.
Yeah, it's a hamster wheel. Yeah.
You don't have to claim to have told me that 100 times. You can just tell me.
Yeah, and start supporting that statement. Yeah, exactly. Go ahead.
No, it's just just talking about that general pattern, the way that people will fixate on anything to avoid the real honest discussion. And the honest discussion is clarify what it is you're trying to explain, like, make a cogent statement. And then the other piece of it is, what are the grounds for your belief? And those are the 2 pieces that actually make for a message. The clear language that is the message, and the grounds behind the message. And if you're not talking about either of those, you're not actually communicating.
Yeah.
But if you have a request of me, you have to make it in clear terms. And that's another thing that comes up a lot, is people start arguing about terms. Well, that's not the right. You're not using the definition. Well, actually, there isn't actually a definition.
Oh man.
People have meanings behind their words, and if you're going to use a word, it's up to you to explain the meaning.
This is such a big. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
This is such a big, I would say, misunderstanding from people. A lot of people in society right now. I mean, there will be times where the semantics argument that we talked about on the communication techniques months ago. In discussion with someone, you use a word. Words have multiple meanings to it, and the way they're used within the structure of which they're crafted, the context, all of it can change everything about it. If I say strike, and I'm talking about a baseball game, then a person has 2 more attempts to hit the ball. They're out, depending on the context. If I say strike in a factory, then I might get fired because I'm calling on people to get loud. So these words.
Strike as in hit somebody, or strike as in use a tool on something. And that's strike isn't even that vague of a word.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of these political discussions have these crazy words like socialism or capitalism that have been so abused over the years. Nobody knows what the fuck they mean.
Oh yeah.
Jeremiah says, yeah, there are commonly accepted usages. That's true. And if we stick to the conventional usages, then what we're talking about is usually not a problem.
And even better,
when people have some idiosyncratic use, they've got their own use of the word. And if you want to use a word in a way that doesn't match the convention, that's fine.
Yes.
But now it's on you to explain how you really mean the word.
And this is where I think you get to. This is where I think you get to the root of the problem. We find agreement on identifying that root, because that requires both parties to be willing to observe that they may have said it in a way that was confusing, and the other person say, okay, I'm going to give them another opportunity to better explain how they mean this. And where we see a lot of issues happen is neither party is willing to do that. One party is saying, nope, you said this word, this is what this word means, that's that, yada yada. And then the other party is saying, no, I said strike, and if you don't understand what strike means, that's your own fucking problem. And so basically, you don't have the willingness from either party to be willing to hear a word from a different context or say.
That is a common miscommunication. One side of that is the person using the word gets to decide what the word means. Now, if 2 people refuse to share a meaning, if I refuse to use your meaning for strike, and you refuse to use my meaning for strike, then we can't communicate.
Yeah.
We have to have a shared definition.
Yeah, exactly. Agreement on definitions.
This idea that they're going to jam a definition, that they're in charge, this is what the word means, and if you don't talk that way, you're wrong or evil or bad. Excuse me. No, it doesn't work that way. You're not in charge of what I mean. You're never going to be in charge of what I mean.
Right.
Just like I'm never going to be in charge of what you mean. Jeremiah says, just like when I explained the difference between nation, country, and government, And those words, again, can be really loaded. And there's this tendency for people to mix up society and economy and government.
And culture.
One way to deal with that, especially for government, is to talk about government agents. If you change your terms a little bit, you can often avoid those vague terms that lead to a lot of hassles. Without shared definitions, there is no point talking. And that's the thing. A lot of people mess this up. Definitions are agreements.
Exactly. That's it. That's the keynote.
They're not facts. When someone says, well, you're using the wrong definition. No, I'm not. Because there isn't a right definition. Right? We didn't get definitions from angels. We didn't go and find E.T. forcing us to use the words. Like, there's nothing in nature that will tell me what the definition is. The definition is a convention. And if you're not willing to come together with someone and find a shared definition, then you can't actually share ideas.
And let's give a really easy example of that right now. Cannibal Troll, as one word, right? Me and you have to find agreement on what that means. If I think it means you're going out and identifying trolls within society and eating them in your basement, then that's a big issue. But what I know because of the agreement we've reached is that Cannibal Troll is identifying trolls for moral standards, correcting them, and being able to do these things to try to better the moral system. So there's a completely different, because of the agreement we reach on what the word actually means. And that goes with every word. You have to find agreement on what you're talking about before you can actually talk about it.
Well, and the funny thing is, cannibal trolling, like, I don't really hunt trolls. And this is something we've been doing in this group for years, from the get-go. And this is something that I discovered in a backhanded way years ago. If you assert proper standards, certain people will identify you as a target and go after you.
Yeah.
And if you don't engage the fight, if you don't actually get aggressive with them, if you follow up on trying to understand what they mean, and if you follow up on what are the grounds for what you mean, and if they're just being aggressive and full of shit, then what becomes obvious is that they're aggressive and full of shit.
Yeah.
If you don't engage the fight to indulge their diversion, then they just look like an asshole.
Sometimes
and that's what pisses them off. And all of a sudden, guess who's the troll?
Yeah.
Well, not the troll because they ended up looking like an idiot with me. Well, whose fucking fault was it that you look like an idiot?